Yeah. Sorry, yeah.
You know, I feel quite strongly that we need to see that we are allowed to resist anything we want. One part of the exercise of our will is that we are allowed to exercise our will to resist. It's very interesting what happens inside of us psychologically when we go through this process of acknowledging that we are allowed to resist. Because what often happens is we don't resist anymore after that. And it's very interesting from a psychological perspective about why that is. A lot of our resistance is generated by a feeling of rebellion. And when we say to ourselves, and when we acknowledge inside of us emotionally that we're allowed to rebel, we then start questioning why we'd want to. And once we start questioning that, usually we start going through the emotion. Yep. And I find a lot of people, you know, when we start saying to you're resistive, they go, oh, am I? And I say, but you're allowed to resist. Oh, I don't feel like I am, I can't, you know. And if they just, for a change, acknowledge that they're allowed to, that God's given them a free will, so that means they're allowed to use their will to resist.
Yeah.
A lot of the times that when they say, oh, I'm just resisting feeling fear, then a lot of times they start feeling fear.
Yeah.
When they say, oh, I'm just resisting feeling sad, then they start going, oh, I'm resisting feeling sad. I'm allowed to resist it. And then they start crying, you know, like a lot of the times. And that's because we need to acknowledge that it's our will that's involved with the resistance as to why that process occurs. And I feel that's very, very important for people to understand. You need to acknowledge that you are allowed to resist. You're allowed to be stagnant. Stop blaming other people for it. It's your choice. But you're allowed to choose that. If that's your choice, you're allowed to choose it. And it's interesting, psychologically, when you see that you're allowed to, you will often feel less rebellion towards the emotion that causes that resistance. So I feel that's a very important point most people need to understand.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about it in terms of truth, because we have resistance to error when we're in truth and resistance to truth when we're in error. But you're stating that the acknowledgement of the resistance allows us to simply feel the emotion which is in play more freely.
It's not the acknowledgement of the resistance, because that's one part. What I'm talking about here is not the acknowledgement.
Will-based part.
No, I'm talking about the acknowledgement that I'm allowed to resist.
Yep.
That's a different thing than acknowledging the resistance itself.
Yep.
Can you see it's two separate things?
Yes, I can see it.
On one hand, I'm allowed to see I'm allowed to resist, and the other one, I'm seeing what I'm resisting, which is two different processes.
Yes, yeah.
And I am allowed to resist what I don't, you know, I'm allowed to not see. I'm allowed to choose to not see.
Yeah.
If I can give a closer illustration of how that may work. Often I find with people who feel, you start seeing the tears run down their face, but they don't want to cry, right? And you say to them, look, you're allowed to cry. And they go, I know, I just can't, right? And I go, you're allowed to not cry. You're allowed to shut it down if you want. And oftentimes after I say that, they burst out crying.
Yeah.
Now, why is that? Because they've now acknowledged that they're allowed to make a choice to resist. And they then automatically start questioning why they're making that choice emotionally. They question it immediately. And this is something we need to understand. It's very different. So it's very different from the will part of it. This is. We're saying, what we're saying is resistance is all about the exercise of our free will. You know, I'm allowed, and what we're saying is when we're in denial, we're exercising our free will to deny, but we also need to acknowledge that we're allowed to deny. We're allowed to not cry. We're allowed to not feel our fear. We're allowed to not feel our shame. We're allowed to not feel anything if we want.
Yeah.
You know, you'll probably get depressed like that, but that's you're allowed to do it if you want. You're allowed to create depression. You're allowed to create a disease. If that's what you want to do to avoid all your emotions, you're allowed to do all of those things, and God will let you do it. God will let you do it because you're allowed to, right? And then once we acknowledge that we are allowed to, oftentimes we start getting into the actual emotion that causes us to want to. Yeah. And that's very different than just, you know, saying we're allowed to feel or not feel our emotion. Because what we're doing psychologically is we're acknowledging the power of our will. So,
And how
and
it's
our-
being exercised.
and how it's being exercised.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. And that's a very powerful thing to help you through resistance.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
good